Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this 11th session of the Thought Leadership for Systems Transformation Program 2022. We're very happy to have Phoebe Tickell today as our guest teacher. Phoebe will spend some time sharing her reflections on the collective narrative, and then we will have time for Q&A. Phoebe, it's your time now.
Fantastic. So it's great to be here and very appreciated these very thorough questions. I feel like it's like a deep philosophy class when I read like all of the questions. I thought the place to start would be the question around like how to bring imagination into the day-to-day life, because really, like, as you're all very aware, like my work is really about how can we exercise imagination in order to connect with our deeper selves and our deeper sense of what is true, what is right, what is sacred. Where I would like to start is also to point out like a common misconception of the work I do. So very many people often think that the work I'm doing is around supporting people to imagine the future and imagine like different futures. In fact, what I see the real power of imagination being is in shifting our perspectives and our mindset, even in the present. And I would argue actually like our imaginations, are atemporal. Because when you imagine the future, you're just imagining. You're imagining, in a way, a present that is not yet there. And so I'll just give a bit of history as well around where Moral Imaginations really was born and how it developed, which I think is also really helpful context for some of the questions that have been asked. So I was in New Zealand in 2017 when the Wanganui River was given personhood. And so I was part of a gathering of folks like innovators and Indigenous leaders in New Zealand, or Aotearoa as it's called in Maori. And something that came up and I became very interested in is if we are granting nature, like mountains and rivers and other places in nature, personhood, and therefore like inviting these entities into our governance, how can human beings actually like facilitate the action of rivers and mountains in governance, in decision making? Because ultimately, if we as human beings who are the gatekeepers and the facilitators of governance have a view of nature that it's just a resource, it's just a kind of physical resource. The example I often give is if you look at a tree and you cost it as how much furniture you can make from the tree, that is absolutely not costing the millions of microorganisms and relationships and the role that tree has got in the wider ecology and ecosystem. So there's something about like the human perception of nature being very key to if we want to bring nature into our governance, which I was very interested in, being a long-time solar punk, being somebody who is interested in also the role of the lever of like utopian visions and how that can help lever the present, because it allows us to imagine better ways of doing things. And then it gives a contrast to the present day. It gives this sense of like, but why not? And I think that's a question that many of us ask when we're children. It's like, why do we do things like that? Why do we go to school? Why do we go to work? Like the why questions, which are seen as very, in a way, quite naive. I think there's a need to bring that back, like the asking of why and the comparing of the present to hypothetical alternative scenarios. So I was very interested in how do you shift perception and how do you shift the perception to see that actually we are not separate from nature, and actually nature itself, even calling it nature, strengthens the perception of a thing that is separate to us. And I was teaching at Schumacher College and very lucky to spend time with amazing Indigenous thinkers and Indigenous academics, and Joanna Macy, who has influenced my work a lot. In fact, I would say her work is almost like a mother tree, and Moral Imaginations is like another tree that has branched off. And she's actually who introduced me to the term moral imagination, which I then sent me down a rabbit hole of looking into cognitive science. And there are cognitive scientists like George Lakoff and Mark Johnson who talk about this embodied cognition, which also is super interesting in terms of the West and the kind of conditioning we've had to think the way we think and to see the way we see. This is like going down a rabbit hole, but just that I really wanted to make it clear that I really saw imagination as a possible tool to help us actually shift the way we see and actually even feel the connection we feel with a part of nature. Like when we look at a tree, and it's very hard to put these things into language because some of it is beyond language. It's like you feel the difference. Like when you've spent time in nature and you've sat and what I saw as a scientist was that the learning that I went through of natural sciences, learning about microbiomes and like the bacteria in the gut, and like, you know, I went really deep into research around the microbiome, learning all about how bacteria even influence like the neurotransmitters in our brain, you know, the vagus nerve, and the more science I learned about interdependency and interrelationship, the more I was like asking how there was such a gap in terms of culture, when science and biology is showing us that we're so deeply interconnected and interdependent with nature, but somehow our perception and culture has not caught up with the science. So instead of becoming a scientist and adding to the already huge amount of research and papers on these subjects of symbiosis and ecology and the microbiome and our interrelationships with all of life, I thought, how could I be a scientist? Like, how can I stay a scientist but change the domain in which I'm a scientist and move to perception and culture? Can I take my background as a biologist and an ecologist and a scientist and apply it to this seemingly impossible challenge of perception, culture, feeling, sensing? And so that's really been my journey into what is now called moral imaginations. And even in the title, I like that there's this contrast between the moral and between imagination, because to me, it's all about this contrast between art and science, between left brain, right brain, and bringing like a unification of those things together. So that's like a really important place to start, that it's the imagination work is not just about thinking about the future, it's about shifting. And you know, one day I would love to do studies on, say, like if there's an exercise I've written called the symbiosis meditation, which you might have seen online, and it's a tool. It's about 8-minute long meditation, and some people get in touch saying that they listen to it every day and that it's the way that they like wake up and connect to nature. And I'm curious about what these kind of meditations and visualizations can actually do to our sense of connectedness. And then another link that I think is interesting to make is between our sense of connectedness and our connection to our inner compass. I guess I have a hypothesis that when we feel more connected to nature, to future generations, to what we've called like a cosmic identity, like a larger identity, like we're more than human, we are more than just this body, we're a whole set of relationships, we are stardust, we're, you know, interrelationships that span the whole planet, we are the planet, like that. When we actually remind ourselves of that every day, what does that do to the kind of decisions we go and make? That is a very, very important kind of question that is also at the heart of this project. Like, do people who more strongly rooted in their understanding of themselves, their connection to their ancestors, their connection to the land, their connection to a sense of Gaia, of the planet, like, do they go on to make decisions that are more in line with pro-social values, I guess is a question. And I think it's a really interesting research question because, you know, on the other hand, you do have nationalism and the environmental, like land-based movement. So it's like, it's not a given that it's definitely promoting like pro-social choice making. It can also, you know, go the other way. And I'm very curious about what it is about that, you know, the fact that it can go either way, people being connected to nature and the land and their heritage, and nationalism, like that's another way that it can go. That's like a very interesting question for me too. So that is like I think an interesting and maybe like not always completely obvious preamble. And then the question of how to bring imagination into the day-to-day, which is actually like what a lot of my work this last year has been, working with organizations. I'm currently working with a very inspiring local council in London. Part of what gives me energy and a sense of being in line with my theory of change is working with organizations and institutions that are not at the edge, that are really like, you know, at the heart of our current day system. Because I think for a long time, I've seen a lot of the kinds of practices and work that I'm doing, like I've seen a lot of that happening at the edges and in the kind of margins. And I think that's really great and really important because, that's where innovation happens, in the places in between the system and institutional environments. But I think I must just really I like the challenge of actually going back into the system and into the boring, the places that are like the boring places, like the local councils or the governments or mainstream organizations or even corporations. Like I'm open to working with corporations that are really actually asking the difficult questions and willing to sit in the discomfort of like, what does it mean to make decisions that are actually on behalf of the planet and actually on behalf of future generations, and like, how can we be part of that movement away from just like human-centric, short-termism, profit-centered decision making? Like, what does the corporation of the ecological age look like? I'm very interested in that question. I'm not taking a judgment towards corporations and kind of writing them off, because if we end up being judgmental about corporations, we have to judge ourselves as well, because we're all taking part in this capitalist system in some way, like obviously some to more degrees than others. But I have a philosophy of if I was to walk a lifetime in your shoes, I would make the same decisions as you. That's a big kind of heuristic I have that also helps me work with a huge range of people and not write people off based on whether they have been part of the capitalist system to this date. There are also boundaries and limits to that. Like, I'm not going to work with unethical organizations that actually don't have any commitment to creating a better world for planet and people. So bringing wildest imagination into our day-to-day life. So what we're doing in Camden is training 30 people as what we're calling imagination activists. And it's really, really fascinating working with the team at Camden, because I'm coming with all of these methodologies and practices, and being someone, I think, also who naturally is quite creative and I'm very comfortable sitting in my right brain. I did a lot of art when I was younger. I was always doing art and science and seeing things in patterns and systems thinking. So like for me, that's quite easy in terms of giving people practices and approaches to do that kind of work. But what we're finding, which is really interesting, is like people need like the scaffolding to even be able to do that kind of thinking. So like creating the space, creating the time, creating the permission, like having the permission to imagine already is a huge thing, like in an organizational setting, like feeling like that is welcome and not going to be dismissed as like daydreaming or irrelevant. Like if I think back to what I know, having worked in corporate environments and also having read a lot about them, like the whole environment is highly competitive, highly political, not geared towards like maximizing creativity and free play and just like wild and radical imagining. Like actually you run a huge risk of being humiliated and cast out. So there's a huge peer pressure to stay on track, like with deliverables and outputs, and be professional and meet targets and like have a very thick skin. And I also think imagining is a very vulnerable thing. It's a vulnerable place to be and thing to do. So the work we are doing, Moral Imaginations is doing with Camden, is creating these environments where people feel safe to imagine, where we go in with a lot of facilitators. So like the room has a large number of like Moral Imaginations facilitators and council workers, or it's not just about Camden, but other places too. And so that allows we're changing what is allowed in those spaces by actually just bringing in people who are almost like positive feedbacking, people sharing things and having ideas and having this sense of like, you can't fail, or like it's safe to fail. And people often ask me for like tools and like exercises and like, conversation, like actually like conversation guides of like what are like, sentences or like prompts that you could take into a team meeting or work with your like an employee in your team. So like actually giving people like some scaffolding around, like, for example, before jumping into a solution, being able to like really like articulate the problem and ask what if questions and think about metaphors for that problem and think about other kind of parallel situations that might yield some of the answers. So this is all quite like very recent work, because to start with, I was really working with like a set number of methodologies and collective imagination practices that were around shifting perspective to future generations, to the more than human world, to nature, to the planet. And now like the feedback I've had is like, yeah, but like, how do we even get like, that's like maybe 3 steps ahead. How do we just start by expanding our imaginations, flexing those muscles of thinking differently and imagining? Luckily, I'm very obvious in what I do. Like there's no surprises. It's like when people invite me, like the name of the organization is Moral Imaginations, like they know that they're not going to get like design thinking or kind of innovation speak. So I think once I'm being invited, there's already so much relationship that has been built to get to that point. But having said that, I have had experiences of threatening the existing order, and I think I'm getting used to that being part of like the role I'm playing in the ecology right now, which is often kind of disruptor, and like being unapologetically just the way I am, which I think has a role and a power to it. I don't think it's always like, I think there are many different roles to making change happen. And I think what I found is it's a careful balance between meeting people where they're at and having like deep empathy for where that is, and actually being able to to take people on that journey with you, versus being provocative, calling things out. But I think since I've had a background as an activist, and I've moved in the activist, like especially climate activism circles quite a lot, the thing I saw was how ineffective that approach is. And I now actually like run workshops and sessions with climate activists, and recently was in Sweden speaking to a group of incredibly inspiring 16 to 22-year-old climate activists, like, with 100,000 followers on Instagram, like these kind of influencers, or like 1 million followers on Twitter, like really influence the climate activists. And the big message that I had for them was like, how are you thinking about like how your narrative meets people who like, how are you having deep empathy for the people that you're currently painting as like the enemy, who are often people like who are single moms, who maybe like have a really hard life and have very little savings and can't buy the green options and don't have the privilege of, having had the education that you've had. So I think empathy is a huge part of actually shifting systems, because if you speak to people as if they're adversarial without actually taking time to imagine and invest in understanding their story, then what you're trying to get across doesn't get across. And that's also the core of imagination activism as a concept. It's like, rather than activism that fights the old system and the old reality and makes change through fighting and criticizing, imagination activism is a call for a new kind of activism that's powered by visioning and imagination, and helping people see how things could be different, and actually like building momentum around a shared sense of ambition and momentum. Even if we don't know what those answers or solutions will look like, there is the ability to have that kind of existential hope that we can be better, that something is possible, that we can find solutions even if we don't have them right now. I also wanted to address the question of how to stay moral under the influence of others and our own human nature. Super interesting question. And also wondering about daily practices that I can recommend, making sure our moral compass is working. And then whoever asked this question also suggested things like eating well, doing breathing exercises, staying healthy internally. I think that also connects back to what we were talking about at the beginning. And I think there's so many different approaches and methodologies to do this, like to stay in balance, to have, as Daniel Schmachtenberger talks about, like the sense making and the meaning making and the decision making, like all of that working healthily so that you can make those decisions based on your inner compass. But I think this is the question really at the heart of the project, is how do you nourish those sense making, meaning making capabilities? Because if it's just eating healthily or exercising a lot, that can still lead us to lead very individualist, self-centered lives. So I think the question I've got is like, how do you expand the moral circle of concern? And something that has come up in like some of the research that we're doing is like, if you go too far on that, if you build too much empathy, that can also paralyze people. Like if you're so empathetic that you're like empathizing with the future generation and empathizing with the people currently in Bangladesh, like how much empathy is enough to make good decisions and how much is too much, and where is that paralysis point? And some of the best leaders who make some of the most difficult decisions that save the most lives actually have like very low empathy, because they're able to look at very horrible, difficult situations, life and death situations, and make decisions that many of us would struggle to make because of having that empathy. So I think it is a good question. I also think it's not just a solo practice. I think it's very key to have people around you who can help be those feedback mechanisms, because we all know that if you get into a position of power, there's a lot of research showing that your empathy reduces, the traits of becoming more narcissistic and even sociopathic increase, but literally that like empathy reduces as you get more power. So as I always think like if you step into a position of power, a really key thing is who is building that like accountability pod, or like those people that you really trust will be willing to reflect back difficult truths about how you might be behaving or decisions you're making, and like be able to help you steer the ship, because I don't think it's something that we can do alone. And I think when we lived in more embedded in communities, that was collective leadership was a lot more present, whereas now it can be very easy to be at the top of a hierarchy and actually be very lonely and have a lot of people around you who are pandering to you and maybe even like warping and distorting your own feedback mechanisms in order around like how to make moral choices and stick connected to the inner compass. And just looking at the question again, like how do you keep your heart engaged? What inspires you to undertake this kind of work? What processes do you use to stay normal and moral as a young person, navigating all of this on behalf of the generation coming up? How do you do it, girl? I love that question. Yeah, I think just a caveat, like I'm not claiming to have it all worked out and be perfect. And I don't think I manage to stay normal, but I know what you mean in terms of how do you stay sane, or maybe how do you stay healthily abnormal, is perhaps the way I'd interpret the question. I think having roots and methods of grounding, like just really kind of grounding oneself in the present moment, in the simple things, is really important, because a lot of this work is so complex and so stressful, like looking at the situation today and like really contending with the questions around morality and leadership within inner compass, and why do we have these systems and how could it be different? And these are huge questions, and as Timothy Morton calls them, like hyper objects that are very difficult to like pin down and like solve. Like there are these unbounded complex issues. If I was to think of like a list of practices or things that are really important to keeping me sane, I think it's reflected in the moral imaginations practice, like connecting to nature. Like it just is a huge regulator and a place where, if you believe in a kind of ecology of mind, it's a place where you can be in dialogue, in communication, but not necessarily with the human world, but you can be in a different kind of communication, and one that is beyond the like rational, linear, problem solving kind of mentality, which I find like very important and nourishing. I think, making sure all the simple things, all the basic things like exercise, going outside, having a good support system, etc. But I think also just I find a lot of relationship and like companionship in both people alive today who are doing similar kind of work. Like I find being in touch with others who are contending with the same questions to be really nourishing and important, but also reading, biographies and people who used to be alive. Like to me, it's very nourishing to read like the autobiography of someone alive 100 years ago and learn that he or she was asking like the same questions and kind of in the same moral dilemmas that I'm having today. So I think that's also quite helpful to me. But I'll keep thinking about it as well.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Phoebe. That's great. It's time for a Q&A.
Yeah. So my question is, what is the opening you see right now moving us forward from unstuckness or the current paradigm? Like where is where are you most excited right now for a moral imagination present?
I think I'm excited by the idea of system abandonment. Like we talk about systems change and changing the current system, and that is important. But I think something that has really deeply excited me is like the idea of system abandonment. Like what happens when you just abandon like a civilization that is not working? Like what would it look like to use the frame of actually leaving the current system and going parallel into creating something else, or a different way of doing things. And I think some of like the combination of also some of the developments happening in like the ethical tech sector, and also some of the developments around DAOs and decentralized autonomous organizations, even though they're still very early on in their innovation cycle. I think the idea that we could use technology to replace some of these incumbent systems and bureaucracies, and actually create the technologies in a way that they are truly decentralized and not monopolistic, and truly put human flourishing at the center. Like I still find that very exciting, even though I'm someone who has left science and technology. I think the idea that even though to this date, I would say it's difficult to tell like whether the net effect of the technologies we've created so far has been more positive or negative. I think that there's just still huge potential for technology that is embedded with values, that is designed in a way that humans and the more than human and the future generations are put at the center. And for example, like some of the developments in digital democracy, the idea that we could be able to make sense of decisions on a huge scale facilitated by AI algorithms, and that are truly like selecting for the kind of world we want to live in. Like I find that exciting. I also find it like terrifying, because I think there are like shadows and things that we program into technology without even realizing that we do so. But at the same time, I can't see a future civilization that is like completely abandoning technology and kind of going back to the land and living like just a fully ecological, like land-based life. And I do think there's a lot of potential and excitement that I have there. I also think, as I said, like some of the legislation around like the rights of nature, and some of this like for example in Camden they've declared a climate emergency. Like sometimes legislation can be a really exciting tool that, even though it is part of the old system, can actually move, not just create different laws, but actually shift mindsets completely. Like the idea of New Zealand giving personhood to a river already did so much for the collective imagination in terms of how we think about nature and an entity of nature like that. So I think legislation is also exciting me. And then I think the other thing that excites me is realizing that so much of what is happening is not on the map. And so this sense of like humanity not being totally mappable, and like we are not cognizant of everything that is happening. There is all sorts of human to human solidarity, mutual aid, people who, as I said, are kind of in that systems abandonment, and in the sense that, and actually following Black feminist activists of the US, I think are really inspiring in this, where they're just like, okay, like we're in late stage capitalism and like systems collapse. Like I refuse to even like engage at all. And I'm just putting my community and mutual aid and building like peer-to-peer systems of mutual aid and support. Like I also find that quite inspiring too. And I think the thing that ultimately inspires me is the plurality of approaches. Like there are all these different people approaching things in all these different ways. And even though the news can be so negative and so pessimistic, I wouldn't go so far into the like Steven Pinker point of view that like the world is getting better and better. But I would say that right now there is an unprecedented number of people who are waking up to the impact of humanity on the climate, on the planet, who are asking difficult questions, who want to do something. And many of them are stuck in systems that mean they can't do something, but I think there is a bending of the arc towards awareness of our impact on the planet. And some of the, some symptoms of that, like the popularity of like Blue Planet and David Attenborough, and like these mainstream signs that consciousness is shifting, which does bring me excitement.
Phoebe, thank you so much. You mentioned earlier in your talk that there was, I believe, some kind of research where they were trying to understand whether people who spend more time working in their inner self make better moral decisions. Do they? Do we know the answer? Is there research out?
No, so that's the research question that I'm interested in. Like, I don't think that research exists. I think what I'm interested in is what are the conditions and the practices that lead to people making decisions that have integrity and don't just serve themselves, or have like an integrity and morality. And the reason I'm curious about it is that I don't think it's as simple as we might think. Like, I don't think just doing mindfulness actually leads to that. There's something else. There are other qualities. There's humbleness, there's trauma, there's life experience, but it's kind of a bit of a mystery, I think. Like, there's a hidden, it's not visible right now. Like, what is it? What is the process, the invisible process, or as Nora Bateson calls it, the fani poesis? Like, what is that invisible life process that leads to somebody making choices that are pro-social, that put other people and the planet first? So it's not research that is happening to my knowledge, but if anybody is doing it, then I would love to hear about it. Yeah, I would just one more build on that is, like, I think it's important to also acknowledge that morality is complex and contextual. It's like you make a choice that you think is good, but then it ends up making harm, or from one perspective it's beneficial, from another it's harmful, and also on a time axis. So it's quite a difficult beast to grapple with, because I don't think there's like black and white, this is good, this is bad, but I do think that it's worth asking the question and being in the practice. So I think there's something around that does feel very important.
I'm still curious about the hyperscale entities. And I'll just preface this and say, there's a wonderful book called The Three Faces of Mind by Elaine de Beauport, who's an educator from South America. And she talks about the need for what we call limbic resonance. Mammals have a limbic system. They relate to each other in ways that reptiles don't. And at the end of her book, she says, if you take the modern corporation, which is essentially this enormous cortex, and you couple it directly to the brainstem, which is just the basic, appetites, you end up with what we see in the world today. There's no limbic system to most corporations. There's no sense of relationship of needing to recognize that what we're doing is affecting other people. So that's kind of tied to this of we have all of these enormously powerful entities. Some of them are individuals, some are governments, some are corporations. Very few seem to be having a sense of reciprocity and need to attend to what we would call the other. And I'm just curious where you see that.
I think you're right. And I also think something comes to mind that I remember from a conversation with Nora at one point, where we were talking about, like, what is it about corporations and organizations, and like where, when people say like organizations are like a collective intelligence of the humans within it. And I think what you're saying is along the lines of where we got to, which was that it's not. Like, there is actually like a missing middle between the people and the entity, and the kind of choices of the entity and the incentives, and actually like the entity having a form of personhood. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the book The Corporation, that makes the case for these entities being like psychopaths, like the psychopathic, because there's, as you say, no limbic system, only gain and greed and profit. So I agree with you. And I think additionally, there's the issue that when people go to work to take part in organizations, they don't take their whole self with them. Like, it's not the same as people living life with each other in a village or in a family, or in another context. Like, there's a kind of bring part of yourself, bring a front, bring a wall, or like a mask. So if we're talking about collective intelligence, to me it's actually more like a collective falseness, like a collective falseness that then I think has these emergent properties of organizations that often feel so toxic for so many people, because they deny the full spectrum of being a human being and being in, having trouble or saying something weird, or I don't know, like having like a weird week or whatever it is. It's like being a human being. It's not linear. You're not a cog in a machine. You're a living being, a living thing. Like sometimes you need to go and spend some time alone. Like if you're in an organization, you just have to stay sitting in your seat. Like it is not a living organism. It's not a living entity. It's actually, to me, it's like the opposite.
Along those lines, in the work you're doing with corporations and governments, communities, wherever you're working, where are you seeing the greatest receptivity, the idea of working with moral imagination? And can you identify any patterns there that would help us to say, when you see this going on, that means there's an openness and maybe there's a way to step in?
So far, the greatest receptivity has been in government, actually, like local government and national government. I think because of the clear mandate for like policy innovation to bring in other perspectives, and that link I made between the like legal changes and the shifts in perspective. So I think there's definitely a resonance there. There's also a strong resonance within kind of communities and grassroots communities and the kind of freelance innovator change maker sector as well. And then I'm just starting to see some of the resonance with the corporations, but only corporations that are like deeply committed to sustainability and for whom making that a part of like their branding and their whole story is important. Because I can absolutely see how moral imagination is almost like sustainability 3.0. Like it's going beyond just sustainable. It's actually saying we need to shift our perspectives and mindsets. So I would say, firstly, local and national government. But in terms of what is the pattern, I think anybody who has come to the point where they've tried everything, like they've tried design thinking, they've tried like systems thinking, they've tried organizational design and collective intelligence, and they're just like, something's not shifting. Like, how do you get something that I'm trying to shift is not shifting even with these different methods. And I think once somebody gets there, they get to the place of like being willing to try working with imagination, which is so off the map, like in terms of there's no deliverables, there's no promises that you can make. You can't guarantee that imagination will happen. You can just create the conditions for it. So I think there needs to be an openness to trying something that is sort of going with acknowledging like the thing I can't see and is not available to me. So we need to go into a place that is fundamentally different.
Talking about corporations, I'm thinking about the story that Daniel Wall is talking about when BP, British Petroleum, that's renamed into Beyond Petroleum, practically killed the flourishing solar industry in Spain. And the person, as far as I understand, the person who was in charge of purchasing all these small enterprises really believed, honestly, that he was doing a good thing. And it's just the logic of the corporation that actually screwed everything up. And who knows, maybe it was planned from the beginning, maybe not. But the result is very bad for the local communities and for the environment. And I also recall my conversation with someone from a multinational corporation a couple of years ago. They were interested in systems change, and they publicly committed to go to 100% renewables. Right, there is a statement like we will become 100% renewables. So, and after a conversation with someone who reports to the head of global responsibility, so it became very clear that what they want to do is they want to create a series of programs to indoctrinate young people, to make them believe that gas is better than renewables, to stay in the old business for as long as possible. And when I actually articulated that, and they confirmed that. So that was quite a surreal experience for me. So my question based on these two stories is, when you do work with corporations, knowing all that, knowing that even people who are honestly into that, who work for these corporations, like, how do you assess risks of actually putting your time, energy, and reputation and empowering those corporations to do things that may go in a different direction later?
It's such a like pertinent question, because I've been thinking I need to build like a real framework in terms of like something I can give corporations before we start working together with some agreements and like actually get commitments. But as you say, like there's the practice of making commitments and breaking them. So I think so far, which is probably not rigorous enough because we haven't been working with so many corporations, like that's very new. So far, it's really been about the relationship with the person. Like, do I feel on a deep cellular level that this person is in integrity, that this person will fight my corner, like in terms of the things I need in order to do this work? Like, can I trust that this person is trustworthy and has enough, power and influence within the organization to actually, to give that kind of assurances? Yeah. And then I think looking at past behavior, like if I look at the past actions and behaviors of BP, I think even to begin working together, I would need to see evidence of significant changes in terms of behavior, commitments, values. Like, I don't think a verbal commitment after the historical record of what an organization like BP has done in terms of like false campaigns and like very sophisticated narrative campaigns and like putting us back like decades in the climate movement. Like, I would really need to see like a huge 180 and commitment, I think. So actions speak louder than words, and relationships are important. I would say like the person who you're working with has to be someone that you trust will like die on the hill with you, I think.
So I just wanted to know, what are some of the strategies that change makers can employ in a situation where the systems are captured by those in authority, in that they demand things to be done their way? They are outside the system, they want to bring some change into the system, but those in authority, they cannot allow some form of change into the system. Like when you talk about, based on your work, when you talk about governance, like you can't get that space to empower people in terms of governance. So they want people to be less informed so that they can have that opportunity to rule them and to continue ruling them forever. But the change makers want to bring some form of change so that these people are empowered, enlightened, so that one day make like correct choices and they also stand for their right.
So I think there's a thank you for the question. I think there are a range of like tactics and approaches, and a lot of this is also in movement theory. I mean, one is, as I say, like the systems abandonment and creating, enough of a movement away from that system that it actually just creates a parallel alternative and is creating disruption and being subversive in that way. I think also the piece around like if you're a solo actor, ultimately the impact you can have is probably through the relationships you can build with the people within that current system. So finding the people that are within the system but who are warm towards the kinds of ideas and values and approaches that are core to the kind of change you want to make. So like finding the insiders who are actually silently, suffering from the system themselves and who would like to help make change from the inside. I think that's like a hugely underrated role is even within places like BP and Shell, like the people who are in that system who may then at some point go on to be the people that sign the paper that allows some huge change to happen. Like that there are those people who are inside and who wake up, who become exposed to different kinds of thinking and ideas, or have like family members who influence them. There was a recent study showing that like in a group of 2,000 business executives, 67% of them were willing to change their business sustainability practices towards being more sustainable based on a conversation with their children. So like there's also like this kind of hidden methods of change that are so not on the map of like change management, like being aware of the power of conversations and relationships and friendships and family members that you can kind of work with and change things by. And then there's the power in numbers, and real like movement building and creating like disruptive alternatives or creating projects that use imagination and narratives to have a disproportionately large impact, even with like limited resources, because if you're working with the tools of the mind and imagination and shifting mindset, I think you can have a disproportionate impact, even if you don't have, the resources to actually like physically change things right there. So I think all of my answers are sort of around influence and the importance of relationship.
Just listening to your answers, you have addressed my current existential agony of what is going on. Like, oh, okay. So I work in a conservative Christian organization. I'm married to a wonderful Christian man. And as I've been trying to work with just very vulnerable children, literally don't have a voice in an indigenous reservation. We were just there yesterday, and even like deaf children in that reservation. So, my heart is for the most vulnerable. And when I'm coming to this horrible reality of the system that I have been working in, it's damaged me. Like I am religious trauma, betrayal trauma. And I am a pariah if I open my mouth, severe patriarchal systems. And I have been purporting that to my precious girls. Like, oh Lord. So, I see it and it's being uncovered for what it is. It makes perfect sense what's been going on. It has been taken over by, a corporate mindset with no heart. No, the limbic system is gone. And it's the worst thing is that it has this label. I'm a sign interpreter, so I talk with my hands. I work with deaf kids. There's this label of it. This is sacred and you can't question this. And to me, that's more egregious because you're using sacred things and people seeking sacred spiritual things, and you're putting them in this system and you can't ask questions, or you're a heretic. It's horrible. So, and then my heart, and my life is for these children. So you answered a lot of the questions. Subversive, I'm all about that. Relationships, like everybody here is just so very conservative. Panamanian or in Panama, Costa Rican Christian missionary. So it's a hard fight. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I do have the influence I have over our young children and to kind of protect them from this. So as a teacher, as I'm in part, and these kids are smart, they teach me so much. Indigenous, they live tribal outside. So how would you instill this in young children, this imagination, like empowerment, and their imagination is important and their personhood, all of that. But I love taking these really complex things and then putting them into, kind of their simplest form. And even like with deaf children, it's a conceptual language. So I can do all kinds of cool stuff in connecting. I can't even do it with my voice linearly. It's all. So I'm really excited to hear what you would have to say.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's really wonderful to hear the way that what we've spoken about has kind of met some of what you're going through and some of the narratives there. And I have so much that comes up for me as I think about almost like the shadow, like dark imagination, which is something I've been thinking about and writing about around, the kind of manipulation or the treacherous narratives. Somebody wrote a question about the treacherous narratives that are invisible, that are actually influencing, like if you think of our imaginations as an ecology or an environment, like a garden or a jungle, what are those invisible pollutants that have been toxifying the soil and depleting the soil of nourishment and nutrients? And how do we actually rewild the imagination and create like a healthy ecosystem that isn't manipulated easily, which I find at the core of my work. With children, I find that it can be really fun to go back to basics and tell them about how like imagination is a superpower and that it's invisible and that it's free and that it's always available to them, and they can really befriend their imagination and create, like there's real power that's available to you, and you can, that it's boundless what you can do with your imagination. And I was recently in Wales running a session with 50 11-year-olds, and I asked them, like, when in life do you use your imagination? And like 16 hands shot up, and they were talking about how they imagine, that there's like a stadium of people watching and cheering them when they're playing football, or like they imagine, when they want to go away, like they imagine getting on a spaceship and befriending an alien. And we ran a session, which I'm happy to talk you through, Heather, maybe after this call, which is around imagining your future self and asking your future self for advice, which is a kind of indirect way of getting in touch with our own deeper knowing, because that the future self is being created by our own imaginations, and therefore our subconscious hopes and dreams and desires. So that's quite a powerful one to do with young people, is to get them to connect to their future self and ask for advice, and then to go and action that advice in the present day when they come back, which can help them navigate towards that. So yeah, and I also would say, like, especially with Indigenous kids, like so much of the work is around healing also ancestral trauma and being like contending with the stories and the history of what has happened, and how to kind of forgive, how to deal with forgiveness, and making sense of, making one's own sense of like feelings of anger. And I mean, this moves more into like processing trauma and emotional processing work. But I think spending time in nature and spending time dreaming and doing artwork and using these capacities of the mind that are not solely linear and rational and kind of left brain modalities are all part of that kind of healing work.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Phoebe. Thank you, everyone. It's time for closing remarks. What do you want to leave us with?
I think my closing remarks come back to one of the final questions in the narrative that you sent over, which is like, what are my wildest dreams for this work and for this vision, or like what kind of vision am I holding? And like for me, my wildest dream and vision is that people build their capacity to imagine, to connect with like a greater intelligence with the planet, and to restore curiosity and creativity. And my greatest dream and vision is that whatever happens next is totally unpredictable and totally off the current map. Like I feel like that is where I source my hope from. It's that things like human responses are possible that we could currently just not imagine. And I guess when you're a child, this is like the belief in magic. It's the belief in things that you don't quite understand. It's also the kind of fuel that I think one has when they become a scientist. It's like this trust in the unknown and the kind of the quest for knowing and for uncovering that which we don't yet understand or we're not familiar with. And I think that from the point of view of like being an evolutionary biologist and geneticist, and this is probably like the cutting edge of my work right now, is bringing in some of my background as an evolutionary biologist and molecular biologist, and trying to map the similarities between and what we can learn from like evolution and from life that is evolving. And when you look at like species and organisms in nature, and they are evolving into a different organism, or kind of on that path of evolution, there's some sort of capacity that they draw upon in order to make those jumps in evolution, and in order to like, innovate, or like whatever the right word is, like that genetic, it's on the level of genetics and epigenetics. There's a latent capacity within life to create newness, like complete newness, radical newness that wasn't even thinkable before. And even if you think about like the Big Bang, that's not life. Now we're jumping to like inanimate, like matter and physics and time and space. But like the Big Bang was just like a continual creation of things that were not there before. And so I think that's like what this work is pointing at, is like, how do we cultivate that? How do we not lose the evolutionary capability of newness and freshness, and the ability to like adapt in weird and wonderful ways in a time when the pressures on us are so great, and when we're going to have to adapt in ways that probably right now do feel impossible. So I'm interested in how we cultivate the capacity to do the impossible.